Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a 1-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
The holiday season officially starts when you get that first card in the mail. Shutterfly makes it easy to add more meaning to the everyday with hundreds of holiday card designs that can be personalized in seconds with your favorite photos from this year. Select your greeting, customize the color, and even add little extras like personalized foil to make a holiday card that really shines. Enjoy 40% off with code SMILE40 at Shutterfly.com and send something meaningful this year. See site for more details.
Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. Episode 100, General Vandamme, Napoleon's Firebrand. Before we begin, I would like to take this moment to provide a 100th episode progress report to our wonderful listeners. We have such a great audience from around the world, and I deeply thank everyone who has listened to our show. We began this podcast in June 2022, and we just reached 121,000 total listens. We have great ratings and reviews, with a 4.9 rating on Apple Podcasts and a 4.8 rating on Spotify. Many thanks again. On Patreon, we have 11 paying members and 28 total members. If you'd like to support our podcast monetarily, please head on over to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. If you'd like to support our podcast in other ways, please go to our YouTube page and hit the subscribe button. We have over 100 videos posted there, including several episodes that you cannot find anywhere else. Thank you again to all of our Patreon members, YouTube subscribers, and podcast listeners. Now, on with the show. We have yet another world-famous guest on the line today. We have David Buttery. Hello, David. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. How are you?
Very well. If you're not familiar with David, he's a wonderful editor of the Napoleonic period. He has a number of books that I highly recommend. One is Napoleon's Paris. Another one is the Waterloo Battlefield Guide. And a third one, which I also recommend, is Napoleonic Britain. And David, how did you kind of get into this time period? What interested you?
Well, like with a lot of people, it was Bernard Cornwell's novels and the Sharpe series with Sharpe in Spain and Portugal and so on. And then I did a history course. This was as a mature student. And I discovered I liked doing the essays so much I didn't want to stop, which I never thought would happen to me. And I started on articles and graduated to books and never looked back, really. I've done battlefield tours and so on. And, it's my sort of thing, the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay, very good. And who are we discussing today? It's a very interesting general of Napoleon's.
This is General Vandamme, who was a very volatile character and one of Napoleon's most infamous generals.
Yeah, infamous and not necessarily a good way. He was a mercurial man, a talented commander, but he had an acid tongue with his subordinates and his equals. What is your thumbnail sketch of Vandamme's character?
Well, Vandamme, to be positive about him, he was an attacking general who you could send against almost anything. He was aggressive, determined to succeed, and this is because he believed in republicanism, in Napoleon, and in France. He was a good administrator, and he was renowned for his ability to train new recruits. However, he was intolerant of others, occasionally acted without orders, prone to seizing supplies, and this led to repeated accusations of looting and embezzlement, and arrogance was his biggest failing, as he thought he was better than everyone else, and worst of all, he let them know it. And his angry and volatile temperament led to frequent clashes with his superiors, and he was constantly engaged in damage control for what he had said or what he had written. And while a talented soldier, Vandamme's lack of restraint and outspokenness denied him what he really wanted most of all, which was a marshal's baton.
Now that you framed it like that, he kind of sounds like General Patton, like couldn't keep his words to himself and had a big ego and let others know about it.
Yes, and interestingly, his only biographer in English, who is an American called John Gallagher. He compares him to General Patton as well. I'd say the one difference is that Vandamme was essentially an infantryman, whereas Patton was a cavalry commander, albeit with Sherman tanks. Interestingly, Patton thought he was a reincarnated French marshal. I don't know if you knew that.
I did. I saw that clip in the Patton movie, and I was like, wow, he really did believe in reincarnation of the soul. So that's interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah, yes, when he's showing some other officers around a battlefield, and they said, well, the way you describe it, it's almost as if you were there. And he says, well, I was there. And they're all acting as if he's crazy.
But yeah, in regards to Vandamme, he was born in November 1770 in Kassel in northern France. So he was a year younger than Napoleon. What was his upbringing like?
Well, his full name was Joseph René Vandamme, and Van it means of in Flemish. For example, you've all heard of Van Helsing in the Dracula films and so on. It means of Helsing, and it can be pronounced Vandamme, but we'll carry on calling him Vandamme because of course, Jean-Claude Van Damme, who may be a relative, we're all used to the pronunciation. But he was born on 5th of November 1770 in Cassel, as you say, and that's a small town in northern France located between Lille and Dunkirk. His family were Flemish and could trace their origins back to the town of Popperinge, which is in the Austrian Netherlands, which is now part of Belgium. And sometime during the revolutionary period, the whole family decided to change their name from Vandamme to Vandamme, because it was two separate words. And this was to make it sound more French, because they realised, their future lay with France. And Flemish was Vandamme's first language, but he only received a fairly poor education, only learning French fluently in his early teens. And his Flemish proved useful during campaigning in the Low Countries especially, because in the Netherlands, obviously, they speak Flemish and French predominantly. But this also made his superiors inclined to support him in commands that were comprised of non-French troops. And the thing is, they were often placed in secondary roles, and much to his resentment, because he was out for glory. That's what he wanted, glory above all else. Now, he was one of three children, lost his mother early at the age of 5, which certainly affected his character, along with his father's decision to marry an older woman called Catherine Termine, who was 19 years his senior, and also brought other children to the family. And this all further disrupted the household. And he is said to have inherited his violent temper from his father, who was called Maurice Vandamme, who was, according to his biographer, a man of authority, abrupt, cutting in his remarks, lively and violent. So keep that in mind for later on.
Yeah, it sounds somewhat chaotic, his upbringing.
Yes, I'd say it was. And I'd say that's fairly typical of the times. I mean, this was a time of revolutionary upheaval.
Yeah. Well, he enlists in the army in 1786 and rises quickly through the ranks. What was his early career like?
Well, his first appointment was it was the French army, but it was the 4th Auxiliary Battalion of the Colonies, and he was sent to Martinique in the Caribbean. Possibly, I mean, again, his biographer speculates on this. We're not 100% sure, but he may not have got on quite so well with the regiments in his locality. But he was promoted for corporal when he was out there in Martinique, but found military service boring and left for France in 1789, and he was declared a deserter. But since France was not in a wartime situation, he was treated fairly leniently and merely stripped of his rank and discharged. But that's an unusual beginning to a stunning military career. But he re-enlists on the 7th of June 1791 as a private in the 24th Line Regiment. But the revolutionary government, they badly needed officers. And like with a lot of revolutions, they'd purged the ranks of royalist officers. You see, an awful lot of them had gone into exile. So, probably because of his aggression and devotion to duty, that made him stand out. And he actually skipped quite a few ranks, rising from private to captain. And another reason for his rapid promotion was his familiarity with the locality. And it meant that he was asked to raise troops, and he attracted 2 lieutenants and 100 men to the colours. And that made him in good stead, and they made him a lieutenant colonel pretty rapidly after that. But crucially, he was politically reliable. With a new government who was, unsure of their standing, they wanted someone who was a dedicated Republican with no ties to the old regime. And his loyalty was more important to them than how competent he was as an officer. Not that he was incompetent, but, this is not an unusual story. A lot of people rose rapidly through the ranks because they needed them. They needed good officers. By 1793, French troops were becoming more seasoned, but they had to introduce conscription that year. And that meant that Vandamme spent a lot of time training new recruits, which stood him in good stead, but he participated in a lot of sieges as well as battles. He actually got promoted to Major General, having only seen one battle, but quite a few sieges. And you have to bear in mind that this time the war had become a savage political conflict. And the officers who failed to achieve their objectives were often faced imprisonment or even the guillotine. And one famous example of that is General Alexander de Beauharnais, who was controversially executed for his failure to take Mainz in 1793. And the government very nearly sent his wife, Josephine, to the guillotine as well. And that would have been the future Empress of France who they would have executed. He hadn't done much wrong, but his experience at that time, Vandamme frequently called his men Republicans rather than just soldiers. And enemy soldiers, he'd call them slaves of various monarchical powers, like slaves of the English or slaves of the Germans, And he hated French royalists and dealt with them hard. And, a lot of émigrés fought for the Allies against their own country. And at Furness, on 22nd of October 1793, he had quite a few of them tried and executed. And later on at Newport in Belgium, Vandamme not only seized the port, but he sank 3 fleeing ships with artillery from the shore. But he executed more French royalists, and he wrote in his diary, he said, "I had 1 émigré shot in front of each corps. The rest were beaten to death by our soldiers, and one saw only red uniforms and bodies along the ocean's shore." So, his first experience of combat was pretty extreme. Certainly the aftermath of it. And although he carried out executions only when directly ordered to do so, this would later be held against him when the Bourbon monarchy returned. He also discovered that his soldiers were kept in very poor supplies, and there was a necessity to requisition food and other commodities. And he wasn't alone in this. I mean, General Jourdan, later Marshal, he was furious about his men were denied what they needed to live, campaign and fight. And just to round off that, I mean, Vandamme commanded a division towards the end of this period, 28th of October 1794 onwards, participated in driving the British out of Holland. And I hadn't realised this, but he was assisted by the weather, as the Dutch would usually flood their lands before an invading army, as a regular strategy, and a very effective strategy. But because it was so cold, they couldn't do that because all the dikes and the canals had frozen. And they very rapidly ejected the British and forced the Dutch to surrender. And his superior, General Moreau, was so pleased with him, he wrote, "What Louis XIV was unable to do at the height of his power, the Republic executed in less than a month."
Yeah, I find it interesting. Napoleon famously told his troops to live off the land. And you mentioned that Vandamme's troops aren't being supplied by the French government. So he's briefly suspended and court-martialed for looting, which I find ironic because weren't all French commanders doing this at the time?
Yes, I thought exactly the same. And yes, I mean, the French revolutionary armies were renowned for living off the land as a deliberate policy. And this wasn't just to save money. It was also to allow them to move more swiftly, as they wouldn't be carrying a large baggage train, trailing in their wake with lots of wagons and so on. However, most supplies were either paid for with civilian authorities, or they would more often give them a promissory note which they could claim at a later date. That said, a lot of civilians who later asked for compensation from the government didn't receive it. And so it's got to be said that he must have been particularly blunt about this. to get into such trouble, because it's not just one time, it's time and time again, sort of either in peacetime it's corruption and embezzlement with his administration. In wartime he's requisitioning food or sometimes weaponry. Others did this as well, like Marshal Andre Messina is particularly renowned for his love of money and seizing it. And famously, Napoleon, at the start of his 1796 campaign in Italy, doesn't make much bones about saying, well, this is your chance for improving your station, soldiers. There's great wealth in these territories we're about to seize. This was an open invitation.
Right.
So, in an atmosphere where a blind eye was regularly turned to looting, he must have been very unsubtle indeed to attract this kind of attention. And the first time he was really denounced as a terrorist and recalled to Paris in 1795 by the Committee of Public Safety. I mean, that's an infamous committee, of course. This is the ones who involved in the Revolutionary Terror. But by that time, this was April 1795, they were no longer likely to execute him. But it was still a serious blight on his career. And as I mentioned earlier, the town of Furness was the heart of the charges of looting. But he had quite some very good character witnesses to speak up for him, including the generals Moreau and Pichegru, who wrote to support him, and the charges were dismissed. But however, he was still sent home in semi-disgrace, you see. It did damage his career.
This episode is brought to you by Opel, the first over-the-counter daily birth control pill available in the U.S. Opel is FDA approved, full prescription strength and estrogen-free. Plus, there's no prescription needed. Finally, the days of needing a prescription for birth control are over. Opel is available online and at most major retailers. Take control of your health and reproductive journey with Opel. Birth control in your control. Use code BIRTHCONTROL for 25% off your first month of Opel at opel.com.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Moreau. In 1799, Vandamme is made general of division, which is basically as high as you can get other than marshal. And at the first Battle of Stockach, he gets into a disagreement with his superior, who happens to be Moreau. Do we know what happened here, and is this a pattern of outspokenness that we'll see over and over again?
Well, yes, again. It's what we've been talking about again. I mean, he performed perfectly well at the Battle of Stockach, and he basically manages to seize disaster out of the jaws of victory, because he nearly flanked the Austrian army, which delayed their advance and forced the Archduke Charles to strip men from his centre to reinforce his flank. And General Jourdan was almost trapped in the retreat, but for Vandamme's attack. So, although it was a French defeat, it could have been a lot worse. He managed to cover the retreat. In the aftermath of this victory, when they promoted him to General of Division in gratitude, one of the infamous representatives of the people, Commissioner Haussmann, accused him of unnecessary requisitions and outright looting in the conquered territories. And this is probably true, as Vandamme never really trusted Germans very much. He was a bit anti-German. He considered them anti-French. And although Moreau intervenes on his behalf and gets him off these charges to an end, Moreau knew there was some substance to this and pointedly asks him in a letter where the 36,000 livres have gone, which lay at the heart of these accusations. And Vandamme was so offended that their relationship never quite recovered after this incident. Although Moreau continues to employ him, and when Moreau is eventually removed from command by Napoleon, Vandamme fails to speak out for him, as he did with Pichegru on another occasion, which we might mention later. But yes, this is, again, it's corruption and looting that came between the two.
Yeah. Regarding Napoleon, it's funny that Napoleon had such an effect on these really hardened, battle tough guys. The quote about Vandamme about Napoleon is, quote, "So it is I who fear neither God nor the devil, tremble like a child when I approach him." That's Vandamme referring to Napoleon. Do we know how they met or when they first met?
Yes, he first met Napoleon at Rastatt, where the Treaty of Campo Formio was being finalised on 17th of October 1797. And that's the treaty at the end of Napoleon's famous first 1796 Italian campaign. Gallagher, again that's his biographer, relates how Bonaparte replaced General Pichegru as Vandamme's idea of the ultimate soldier, and he was certainly seduced by the new general's charisma and magnetic personality, which wasn't at all unusual. A lot of people were. But he was very displeased that Bonaparte fails to ask him to participate in his expedition to Egypt later on. But in truth, this is because they'd not served together, and although Bonaparte liked him, he just didn't know him very well. And it's a measure of what Vandamme was like, that even after he becomes first consul, Vandamme continued to address him as Mon Général rather than first consul, because he respected his military talents more than his role of head of state. And many officers wouldn't have got away with this. So that tells you something about him. Vandamme also disliked the directory government that the consulate replaces, because they'd held his career back and there'd been numerous allegations against him. But if I could just make a significant point about his relationship with Napoleon here, it's significant that he didn't serve with him in his first campaign in Italy in 1796, or his invasion of Egypt, and he also didn't support him during the coup of Brumaire, not because of, he probably would have supported him, he just wasn't in Paris at the time. But those are three incidents that people who had supported Napoleon or served with him on those campaigns, he felt particular gratitude to them, and they felt like an elite within the French army. And they were treated as such by Napoleon. I mean, he never forgot their support at a crucial time, and he favoured them accordingly. So when we think about why Vandamme never receives the promotion he wanted, those are three good reasons there.
That's an excellent point, because, you think about the marshals who did get on that first list, and a lot of them did serve with them in Italy. Not all of them. Marshal Ney was in Germany under Moreau, but Davout served with him in Egypt. Obviously Lannes, Marmont, Massena, Augereau were in Italy. So I wonder, if Vandamme had served under him earlier, if he would have got the marshal's baton. In moving on the timeline, in 1805, Vandamme is finally serving under Napoleon directly at the famous Battle of Austerlitz, and helps capture the pivotal Pratzen Heights in this battle. How was he rewarded by Napoleon for his services? Right.
Well, Napoleon directly rewarded him with the Grand Eagle of the Legion of Honor, which is the highest degree of the Legion of Honor. And he was already one of the earlier recipients of it, a lesser award, with, I think, Commandant of the Legion of Honor, which he'd received in 1804. But he performed exceedingly well during the Battle of Austerlitz. Right from the start, you might remember Napoleon decides to quietly tour the lines, and it turns into something else. It turns into almost a victory parade before the battle. And everyone's shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" And long live the Emperor. Yeah. And he was famously seen stamping his feet and roaring out, "Vive l'Empereur!" as the procession proceeds through the lines. And, the Russians and the Austrians are thinking, what's going on over there? As you say, his division and Saint-Hilaire's division, which are the 1st and 2nd divisions of Soult's 4th Corps, made the famous counterattack on the Pratzen Heights, just as Napoleon had enticed the Allies to attack his seemingly weak right wing. And Soult famously predicted it would only take them 10 minutes to seize the heights. And there was serious fighting when they got to the summit, when the Russian and Austrian battalions realized what was going on and counterattacked them in turn. Now, Soult tried to claim the credit for this famous assault, but Baron Thibault, who I've read quite a bit of with his memoirs, he was critical of this and claimed that Vandamme played a far more crucial role. And significantly, Napoleon denied Soult's request to be made Duke of Austerlitz. Whether that's an acknowledgement for Vandamme's role, or more because Napoleon wanted to keep the glory of Austerlitz for himself, it's debatable. But once again, he couldn't hold himself back. At the end of this great victory, arguably Napoleon's greatest victory, and he played a good role in it. And he'd been wounded only slightly, but he'd he'd not only held on to the Pratzen Heights, but he participated in the pursuit to an extent. But the emperor, he decides to halt the pursuit, and he deliberately allows about 15,000 Austrian and Russian troops to evade them. And he did this more for political reasons than anything else, because, he wants to negotiate a peace settlement, and he thinks, well, we've done them enough damage. We don't need to do further slaughter. But many officers criticized this decision on military grounds. And Vandamme, well, I'll read you what Baron Thibault said about this. He said at the head of these was General Vandamme, who exclaimed on hearing of it, "To spare them today is to have them in Paris 6 years hence." And in 8 years hence, they were there. And see, once again, he managed to tarnish the glory he'd won at Austerlitz by his criticism of Napoleon, which, however well-founded it may have been, would not have amused the emperor. And it's possible that Vandamme had these words reported to him, you see, more than possible. It's a shame, really. Basically, to sum it up really quickly, I mean, Vandamme just couldn't keep his mouth shut when he needed to.
Yeah, and it's funny, like, how these words come back to the emperor. Like, I know Marshal Bernadotte would complain about Napoleon, especially at Wagram, and it would make his way back to Napoleon. So you wonder, right, if he had just kept his mouth shut, maybe he would get the marshal's baton. But his career continues to grow. In 1806, 1807, he performs well in those battles against Prussia and is made Count of the Empire by Napoleon. And I want to talk about the famous quotes regarding Vandamme. The first being from Napoleon: "If I had two of you, the only solution would have to be to hang the other," end quote. And then the other being, quote, "If I were to launch a campaign against Lucifer and hell, Vandamme would lead my vanguard," end quote. Now, these are like good army compliments to compliment an officer, but Napoleon had an eye for talent, right? He didn't really care if Vandamme had an acid tongue.
Well, I'd say yes and no. I think yes, that the emperor was a wonderful judge of character, and he recognized Vandamme's talent as a general, especially as a fighting general. But he acknowledged that his tactical aggression and strategic abilities came at a price. He saw him as a valuable subordinate, but one that had to be employed with caution. So essentially, as we've already said, I mean, he was his own worst enemy, who alienated those who may otherwise have helped him. And to my mind, Vandamme's key failing was his arrogance, as he was far from being the only good commander in the French army. I mean, it's a time when we've got some exceptional commanders in the French army. And if he'd been a little more forgiving of others' failings, I think Napoleon would have made him a marshal. And you were saying about these phrases, there's several different versions of them. I particularly like this one. If I had two Vandammes, I would have one shot. But I only have one, and I keep him for myself because I need him, and I'm unable to replace him. Now, I used this during the Waterloo Bicentenary Tour when I was running Coach Zeithen, named after a Prussian general. And it drew a number of comments from guests who thought he was a brave soldier, but totally bereft of common sense, particularly when I related what he'd said to the Tsar, which we'll touch upon later. I think Napoleon was a superb man manager and judge of character, but he recognized his limits. He believed he could only tolerate so much. And we'll see when we review his clash with his brother and so on. He had to bring him into line so many different times. But a good soldier, a bit of a nightmare to handle.
The 1809 promotions to marshal, there are three of them, and the three that are promoted have all three have questionable careers. But let's talk about that. Vandamme performs well in the 1809 war against Austria. He does well. He's at Ebensburg, Landshut, Eckmühl, and Wagram, so he's all the big ones primarily. But after the defeat of Austria, Napoleon names three new marshals. Marshal Oudinot, who's famous grenadiers, and he's a strict disciplinarian, although not the smartest guy. Marshal MacDonald, who's very honest, but is very unlucky. And then finally Marshal Marmont, who's one of his oldest friends, but very young and very easily offended. Do you think Vandamme would have been better than one of these three?
Yes, I think he would. I mean, MacDonald in particular. I mean, you mentioned the Battle of. Actually, I think it was either Wagram or Aspen-Eslin, which are two linked battles.
Yep.
And he performed very valiantly, but his famous advance in square, he'd taken significant losses. You'd have thought that would have held him back. I'd also like to say, just to outline this for people, but I should say that the title of Marshal of Empire is actually a civil rank rather than a military one. And Napoleon intended his marshalate to have a voice in government for the army, because he knew he could rely on the support of his army far more than civilian sources. And he often reminded his marshals that theirs was a court rank, as in used in court, and that their authority didn't actually exceed that of General of Division, which Vandamme already was, at least on the battlefield. However, the Emperor took care never to place any marshal under the command of a general of division, as that would be perceived as an insult. So in some ways it was a senior rank. I mean, we've already touched on the numerous accusations against Vandamme, which was quite an achievement in an army renowned for living off the land, as we've said.
Yeah.
But here's another one that isn't quite so well known. There's an unfortunate incident was actually Vandamme trying to help somebody. And this was his former chief, General Pichegru. And he naively supports him, he'd been accused of treachery by various officers. And he'd served under him and held him in great respect. And he defended him in writing, but Pichegru resigned on 25th of March, 1796, but then defects to the Allies very shortly afterwards, taking a fishing vessel by force with a few other officers and sailing to England. And no one was more surprised and hurt than Vandamme. And while Napoleon definitely prized loyalty above everything else, he'd supported the wrong man in this case. And consequently, he was transferred to another division, and questions were raised about his close relationship with someone who was essentially a traitor.
Yeah.
You see, that's something that's often passed over a little. And as I think I might have said before, Pichegru was a man that Vandamme had idolized as a very efficient general.
Right.
But also, again, we've touched on it, that it was very difficult for his seniors to control. And really, it was only Napoleon and Marshal Davout who managed to impose their will on Napoleon and remind him of his place.
On Vandamme, yeah.
Yeah. Of Vandamme, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting, the quote, when he finds out he's not going to be one of the three new marshals. He's fuming, and he says, quote, "If it weren't for my efforts, Napoleon would still be keeping pigs in Corsica," end quote.
Yes, indeed. Well, this is
not how you want to talk about your boss, probably.
Absolutely. I mean, it's this conversation with Marshal MacDonald was an absolute classic example of the sort of remark that, again, may well have got back to the Emperor, and very few men like to be reminded of their humble origins, and in such an insulting fashion. And, well, let's be honest, Napoleon had already made great achievements up to this point, which had nothing to do with Vandamme. If we've talked about Italy, Egypt, and so on. He wasn't at Marengo either in the second campaign of Italy. Vandamme misses out on quite a bit of campaigning, or he's there and he doesn't participate in the battle itself. For example, at Wagram, he was watching it from a distance. Not his fault. He was ordered to defend the river crossings.
It's interesting. Not too many of Napoleon's officers, they recognize his genius and his ability. Very few of them, maybe Bernadotte and maybe one or two others, thought they were actually as smart or smarter than Napoleon. But most of them respected his abilities and his intelligence. Like, all right, Napoleon did this on his own.
Absolutely. And I think Napoleon would have realized that this ill-conceived statement was made in anger, no doubt. Yeah. But it just reveals that Vandamme was his own worst enemy.
Well, moving forward in the timeline, in the 1812 invasion of Russia, he's serving under Napoleon's sort of silly brother, Jerome Bonaparte, who's king of Westphalia. But during the invasion, Vandamme is sent home. Do we know what happened here? Was it I know Davout had a lot of disagreements with Jerome, as did Napoleon. You know the story here?
Yes, but can I just turn back the clock just slightly to say that even before 1812, Vandamme had developed an unfortunate relationship with Jerome Bonaparte. And he participated in the campaign that had won his kingdom for him in 1807. And this is when he'd been appointed as second in command of the 11th Corps under Jerome, who he considered to be incompetent and held his position due to nepotism alone. You know, he was Napoleon's brother, and that was the only reason he had this command, right. Which, it has to be said, there's some truth to. And this campaign was comprised mostly of sieges. Vandamme seized town after town, including Breslau, and he fought off an attempt to retake the city, and then the sieges of Schweidnitz, Niza, and Glatz. But Napoleon had already decided to appoint his brother the King of Westphalia and wanted him to reap the glory from this campaign in order to impress his future subjects. And therefore, he not only sees the limelight in victory parades and celebrations, but at least twice turns up right at the end of sieges where Vandamme has done all the hard work and takes over and says, oh, yes, I'm Jerome and I'm the emperor's brother. And, you know, you can understand why Vandamme wasn't very happy about this. Mm-hmm. And just to add, I ought to say that one of the grossest accusations against him, against Vandamme, was at this time, just in the aftermath of that campaign. It's called the Strasbourg affair. And this is where General Legrand alleged that Vandamme had been looting. And they confiscated a wagon load of goods. They impounded it, and the officer commanding it was arrested. And Marshal Berthier, famously Napoleon's chief of staff, took the allegations very seriously and wrote privately that he said that Vandamme was a bad officer without service or talents. And although the charges were ultimately dismissed to Berthier's embarrassment, you know, this was all of this campaign they'd started off very badly, Jerome and Berthier and Vandamme. But after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, when the Tsar met Napoleon, Jerome gains his crown, King of Westphalia, and Vandamme has been given the military order of Württemberg and becomes Count of the Empire and Count of Undsberg. But then the Grand Army assembles for one of the greatest invasions ever assembled up to that point, the invasion of Russia. And Vandamme was placed in command of 8th Corps, which was the Westphalian Corps. But crucially, it's also under the supreme command of the King of Westphalia. And even before the campaign begins, there's accusations of looting and forced requisitions made against Vandamme, and he in turn is complaining about his men don't have enough supplies. And this is in Germany and later in Poland when they're marching to the Russian border. And Vandamme refuses to accept orders from Jerome's chief of staff and orders with the king himself incessantly in a string of letters. And ultimately, Vandamme believes that Napoleon had appointed him as a tried and tested soldier to give good advice to his brother. Now, that was almost certainly true. However, he was incorrect, and he thought that Napoleon would tolerate what amounts to gross insubordination. And when Jerome's arguments with him become so heated that Jerome removes him from command, Napoleon not only refuses to intervene, but refuses to give him another command. And when they march over the Niemen into Russia, Vandamme follows sort of pathetically in the wake of the emperor, sort of begging for another command, but ultimately has to give up and returns to France. But ironically, Jerome was very soon after admonished by Napoleon for the poor handling of 8th Corps. And Napoleon orders Marshal Davout, who he mentioned, to assume his command. And Jerome felt so insulted that he leaves for France too. So goes to show you that Vandamme wasn't entirely unjustified.
Yeah, and you wonder, like, with all the loss of life, if Vandamme's life might have been saved by his, insubordination, maybe. Just thank God he was sent home. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, with what happened in Russia, it's sort of maybe he was ultimately he looked back on it and thought it's a good job I didn't go, and missed out on one of the most horrific battles of the era, Borodino, and the destruction of Moscow, and of course the terrible retreat from Moscow.
Yeah. Well, it's not long before Vandamme is back in action. In 1813, he's commanding a corps against the Allies. Napoleon famously defeats the Allies at the Battle of Dresden. But the aftermath of that is somewhat controversial. Vandamme suffers a huge defeat at Culm. And a lot of people blame Napoleon for this loss. Some blame Vandamme, but can you tell us kind of what happened at the aftermath of Dresden?
Absolutely. This is an interesting campaign. It's not studied as much as some of the Napoleonic campaigns. But in 1813, the Allies had decided to adopt the Trachenberg Plan, which is named after the Trachenberg Palace where it was agreed. And they'd realized that Napoleon was so devastatingly effective as a general that they would avoid armies. They would retreat before armies commanded by the emperor in person, and they would target those commanded by his marshals. And the reason I mention this is it's exactly what happens, and this strategy pays off. It's a well-thought-out strategy. And the Battle of Dresden, 26th or 27th of August, Marshal Saint-Cyr is attacked by, I think it's as many as 230,000 Austrian and Russian troops under a number of different armies, but commanded by General Schwarzenberg overall, because it was a vital supply base for the French army. Napoleon came to relieve the city, drives off the besiegers, and Vandamme's corps play a big part in this. He's finally got by what he wanted, by the way. He's got a largely French corps that he's in command of. And he fights at Pirna and prevents Allied reinforcements from intervening as Napoleon brings the Imperial Guard to Saint-Cyr's assistance. And Dresden's a victory for the French, inflicting about 38,000 casualties on the Allies and taking 13,000 prisoners in return for about 10,000 casualties. But this is where things start to go wrong. Napoleon sends Vandamme off to cut off the Allied retreat. But the armies he's got on the flanks under Marshal Oudinot, his army is defeated at Gross-Beeren, and MacDonald is defeated at Katzbach in late August. And they've been ordered to prevent other Allied armies approaching Dresden. And meanwhile, Vandamme is... Napoleon hoped he could reach the town of Teplitz before the Allies could reach that area, and that would see the Bohemian army hopelessly trapped in the mountains. But what happens is that Vandamme's got his first corps of about 32,000 men. He attacks General Osterman's 44,000 strong force that had decided to turn at bay and cover the Allied retreat at Preston,
right.
About 35 kilometres southeast of Dresden. And the two armies engage in an indecisive frontal battle until General Kleist's force of about another 10,000 Prussians retreating from Dresden stumble into First Corps' rear. And Vandamme is essentially encircled at Culm. At first, he believes the approaching force is Napoleon and the Imperial Guard. Mm-hmm. And what had happened is Napoleon, because of the defeats of his marshals, he had been intending to enforce, he was coming up behind Vandamme, but he'd had to pull back about at least 10, 15 miles. And First Corps is trapped near Culm, and it fights furiously, but only about half of Vandamme's corps is able to fight their way out of it. The already tired Prussians who are retreating from Dresden, they don't want to face men desperate to escape, and ultimately, it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
Like I say, roughly half of Vandamme's force elude them. Around about 13,000 French are taken prisoners of war, with all of First Corps' guns and equipment, but they inflict at least 11,000 casualties on the Allies. And Vandamme valiantly acts as he insists on commanding the rear guard. and is almost killed. Cossacks are about to cut him and his staff officers down when a Russian officer intervenes. Ironically, a Russian naval officer who, Vandamme mistakes for a general because of his uniform, which was far more elaborate than he was expecting.
So it sounds to me like it's Napoleon's fault.
Yes, I was just leading into that. Yes, it's. Napoleon receives the details of these losses coldly, and he says he couldn't understand how Vandamme had let himself be drawn further and further into Bohemia. And Napoleon said, with an army that is fleeing, it is necessary to give a bridge of gold or to oppose it with a barrier of steel. Vandamme was not able to be a barrier of steel. And Dresden joins the list of victories like Lutzen and Bautzen as a list of valueless victories that couldn't be exploited.
Yep.
But I think that Vandamme paid the price for poor communication and staffing officers committed by Napoleon and Marshal Berthier, who didn't manage to get him to the message to him that they were withdrawing and not following in his wake. And also, some of Vandamme's heavy artillery doesn't manage to catch up with him, and this was due to a staffing error as well. I'm one of those who believe that Napoleon was at least partially at fault for that and wouldn't admit to it. But it's also worth realising that it's also, rather than just assessing it as a French defeat, it was an Allied victory. Alexander Mikhailovsky-Danilevsky, who was an aide-de-camp to the Tsar, he said in the aftermath of this victory, he said, joy was depicted on his face. It was the perfect defeat of his enemies, at which he was personally present. Until the end of his life, he spoke about it with a special pleasure. Although he subsequently won victories incomparably more significant, the Culm battle was always his favourite subject of memory. So that tells you something. It was, the Allies had finally, they'd scored a victory against Napoleon, and they'd washed away the shame of the defeat at Dresden. And especially, this was very good for Allied morale.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Vandamme and 13,000 of his men are captured. And there's an incredible exchange between Vandamme and Tsar Alexander of Russia. And this shows to me how just brave and uncaring Vandamme is. But Vandamme is dragged before the Tsar and his brother Grand Duke Constantine. Constantine allegedly stripped Vandamme's sword away from him, which is a big breach of chivalry and honor. Then Alexander accused Vandamme of looting, to which Vandamme replied, quote, "At least I haven't been accused of killing my father," end quote, referring to the fact that Alexander was rumored to be involved in the death of his father, Tsar Paul, to seize the Russian throne. It sounds almost too brazen to be true, but knowing Vandamme, do you think it's accurate?
Well, interestingly, there's two different versions of this encounter. Now, the one endorsed by John Gallagher, Vandamme's most recent biographer, is that he was allowed to keep his sword when captured, and although he offered it to the officer who took him prisoner, and he then offered it to the Grand Duke, who also declined the sword, but said that he must present it to the Tsar. And the Tsar took it ceremoniously, but returned it as a mark of respect. And Vandamme's one request was that the Tsar wouldn't hand him over to the Austrians. I should point out that the Emperor Francis I of Austria was also present at this encounter, and the Tsar graciously said he wouldn't. And although he was displayed as a prisoner of war in Prague, albeit in a subtle fashion, he was well treated as a prisoner of war in Russia and placed under the jurisdiction of the governor of Moscow. Now, that's the first version. The second version accords with what you've said. And this sees the Grand Duke snatch Vandamme's sword from him after he's... we're not told what insulting remark he's made from him, but, it would take quite a lot. And so that altercation isn't recorded, but the Tsar certainly doesn't return it. And when he coldly accuses him of being a looter and a pillager, Vandamme responds, as you said, "Well, at least I haven't been accused of killing my father," referring to the murder of Tsar Paul I. I mean, one historian, Haythornthwaite, he endorses this version of events, among others, and goes on to say that Vandamme was kept under close house arrest in Russia and treated very disrespectfully during his time in captivity. And this is one of those occasions when, in answer to your question, it depends on who you believe here. I've got to say I favour the second story, but quite how well it's supported with primary source accounts, sort of. Because, of course, the Russians may not have been that proud of it if they'd treated him in that fashion.
Right.
So it depends on who you believe.
But he returns to France after Napoleon's abdication, the first abdication. But in 1815, Vandamme flocks to Napoleon after his return from Elba. What role does he serve in Napoleon's big Waterloo campaign?
Well, arguably, the Waterloo campaign is his finest hour, really, and it's a very interesting campaign. But it's, the campaign is dominated by the battles with the British at Quatre Bras and later at Waterloo. Now, Vandamme is in the less well-covered battles at Ligny and at Wavre. Mm-hmm. And, a recent historian called it a campaign of 3 battles, but it's actually a campaign of 4 battles. This tells you something about the Battle of Wavre. It's not written about very much. There's very few books on Wavre itself. Now, I find Wavre extremely interesting and was very pleased that my publisher allowed me to put a complete chapter in about it in my Waterloo Battlefield Guide.
I'm a big fan of Grouchy. I think he gets too much criticism, but we'll get into that.
Absolutely. But I'll deal with Ligny first, and Vandamme's Third Corps is seriously engaged at the Battle of Ligny, and he's on Napoleon's left wing. His corps fight very hard, and just when Napoleon is on the verge of committing the Imperial Guard in the centre to strike the decisive blow, it's Vandamme's men under Vandamme's command spot an unidentified column of men approaching from the west, and there was a recent book by Uffendale called The Eagle's Last Triumph, and he says that the acuteness of this crisis had never been recognised. Napoleon's left wing was in tatters and apparently about to be crushed by a strong enemy column. Defeat loomed large. And this proved to be d'Erlon's corps, marching between Ligny and Quatre Bras, and is ultimately misdirected by orders from both Napoleon and Ney, Marshal Ney, who both want his corps present at their battlefield. And if it had arrived at either battle, it could have been decisive. This is one of the great what-ifs of the Waterloo campaign. And ultimately, it arrives at neither. And Ligny was a particularly hard-fought battle, by the way, with musketry volleys exchanged at very close quarters, artillery bombardments against infantry deployed on the forward slopes by the Prussians. A lot of these men were shot down with no chance to respond. And there was considerable bayonet work in the villages.
Yeah, and Marshal Blucher was almost killed.
Absolutely. He's counter-attacking with a cavalry charge, and his horse is shot and falls over him, and they have a lot of trouble extricating him from under his horse. And he's ridden over, apparently, by cavalry of both sides. But Sergeant Hippolyte Mordaunt of the Imperial Guard, he commented that in the aftermath of the battle, that more than 4,000 dead soldiers were piled on an area less in measurement than the Tuileries Garden, some 300 or 400 yards square. And one can picture the rage with which each side dashed against its foes. It was a particularly nasty close quarters battle. And after the battle, Napoleon hesitates to commit the guard. Then during the battle, he hesitates to commit them. Finally does when they identify d'Erlon's corps. But then he delays the pursuit of the Prussians, which is a crucial point in assessing Grouchy. And at this point, Vandamme comments in a staged whisper, because he's with the staff officers surrounding Napoleon. He says, the Napoleon we knew is no more. And again, this is not the way to get promoted. And however true it may have been. And General Girard, who is also in the same command, he is also placed under Grouchy with Vandamme. He called the delays both incomprehensible and irredeemable, because Napoleon delays the pursuit of the Prussians until he has positive news from Marshal Ney. And earlier on in his career, he probably would have taken the chance and sent some sort of force after the Prussians. Ultimately, for Wavre, though, he commits about a third of his army, which is a very large amount of men, to this pursuit. And the Battle of Wavre follows on from this point. And as you say, he was appointed under Marshal Emmanuel Grouchy. And I've left a remark about leaning out. When he's appointed to his command, Vandamme says something along the lines of, I have never accepted an order from a cavalryman, referring to Marshal Grouchy.
Well, again, you wonder if there's jealousy there. Like, all right, he promoted Grouchy in 1815. Where's my baton? Like, this guy is getting
Absolutely. And it should be said that Grouchy received his promotion, although he was a competent cavalry commander, but he'd never commanded all three arms in conjunction, and at least at divisional level or corps level, whereas Vandamme had. Mm-hmm. And this explains his comment about him being a cavalryman alone. Yeah. And Napoleon has to intervene directly through Marshal Soult, who by then is his chief of staff. First, he has to tell Vandamme to obey Soult's orders because he doesn't like Soult either.
Right.
And then he's got to tell him, put him in his place and say, look, I've placed you under Grouchy's command. You've got to do what he says.
Right.
But, yes, at Wavre, and I should point out, it's quite a frustrating battlefield in some ways. It's a confusing one. And when I navigated around it in the last 10 years a few times, it lacks road signs for most locations. Right. Most people in Wavre today are unaware that a big battle had taken place there during the Napoleonic Wars. They know about the First World War and Second World War involvement, but not the Napoleonics. And we had a lot of trouble finding things. And I can remember we did a preliminary study of a recce of the battlefield before the bicentenary event because it was that important. Right. And we tried to find General Girard's monument. And someone turned on me, we'd got to the location. And I said, well, I seem to remember it being here. And someone said, well, you're the writer of the battlefield guide. You ought to know where it is. And, that evening we're desperately studying to find out what's happened to this monument. And the Belgians had moved it about a quarter of a mile.
Oh, there you go.
So I was vindicated slightly, but this goes to show it's complicated.
Well, let's talk about it because I think Wavre is arguably Grouchy's finest hour. He wins the battle, he extricates his men and gets them back to Paris to fight again. Now, the critical part is allegedly Vandamme and Girard pleaded with Grouchy to disengage with the Prussians and march to the sound of the guns at Waterloo. But I don't even know if he could have made it there in time to make a difference. What is your opinion?
I've been to the farmhouse of Evillard, where this altercation took place. And the famous line was, Monsieur le Maréchal, it is your duty to march to the sound of the cannon. But this was actually said by General Girard. And it's disputed whether Vandamme was actually present. But if he was, I think Vandamme had finally started to learn. And although he may have agreed with Girard, failed to say anything. Incidentally, when he says Monsieur le Marshal, that in itself is disrespectful. So Mr. Marshal, you better get on and do this. It's not good. But and I agree with you that it was virtually too late by that time. Unless he'd marched directly to Waterloo, even then it's questionable whether he would arrive in time or whether he would have run smack into the Prussians trying to elude his pursuit.
Right.
And it's very highly questionable. And at this point, he didn't fully know where the Prussians were. So, Grouchy probably made the right decision for the wrong reasons.
Right.
But when they do discover that the Prussians have occupied the town of Wavre, General Vandamme mounts a rather reckless attack right into Wavre. And I should say that Wavre was a fairly sizable town, and it was split, or at least a large suburb was split by the River Deal that has only 2 bridges over it in the centre of town. And although it's a narrow river, it was in spate at the time. It had flooded. All throughout the fields it had flooded and it broken its banks, made it a far more difficult barrier than otherwise would have been the case. But in the town, the Prussians had mounted a very good defence. They'd loopholed houses along the bridges, barricaded the bridges and manned them themselves. and they'd placed artillery between the houses and on the heights behind the town to enfilade the approaches to the bridges. And they'd also placed reserves in sheltered positions behind the houses along the riverbank, and it was a very tough nut to crack.
Yeah.
And Lieutenant Colonel Berthazeni, he comments on what Vandamme did, and he said he simply ordered Habert's division to enter it, meaning Wavre, in column, and in spite of the murderous fire of the enemy, this column reached the bridge, but when Habert was wounded, it retired in disorder. This stupid attack cost us 500 or 600 men. And I think, although Berthazeni had a bit of an axe to grind against Vandamme, he certainly, the strategy of this immediate attack was probably motivated by a desire to impress the emperor with swift results. Now, some historians believe that he also may have believed that the Prussians were already withdrawing, but this leads to a battle of attrition, and they attack the bridges a few times. And Colonel Maury of the 70th Line, he attacks the Bridge of Christ in the centre. And he'd been let down by his men the day before in Ligny. And he shouts at them sort of, "What, rabble? You dishonoured me the day before yesterday and you offend me again tomorrow. So follow me, he shouts. And But this ends unhappily. He's shot down before the bridge. And the Prussians are reaching over the barrier to grab the eagle of the 70th. Well, they managed to grab it, and there's a tug of war ensues between the French and the Prussians for this trophy. And of course, losing an eagle was a big disgrace to a regiment.
Yep. Yeah, and Grouchy wins, and Napoleon, he allowed some freedom of his commanders, but 9 times out of 10, Napoleon wants you to follow orders to the letter. So for Grouchy to just pull up stakes and run to Waterloo, in hindsight, yes, maybe he could have, but that wasn't his order.
Well, I'm one of Grouchy's fans.
Yeah.
But you see, crucially, he was blamed by the emperor, which was enough to damn him in the eyes of most Frenchmen. Yeah. And in my Napoleon's Paris book, I talk about his tomb in Père Lachaise Cemetery. It's not recorded why, but he was denied a place in the marshal's quarter. 2 marshals were. But he's not buried with his comrades because he was roundly blamed for the emperor's defeat at Waterloo. I have to say, I think he was given imprecise orders. He was sent off. By the way, at about 11 o'clock the following morning after the Battle of Ligny, which was far too late. There's a lot of inexplicable things about Napoleon's decision in the Waterloo campaign, but I think I lay the blame squarely and firmly on Napoleon here for imprecise orders, difficulties in communication. And also he shouldn't have sent so many people with Grouchy. If he'd given him only 15,000 men instead of the 33,000 he did give him. There's a lot of odd decisions which have never been fully explained there.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to Vandamme. After Napoleon's downfall in 1815, he's exiled to the United States by the Bourbons. What is his later career like?
He's essentially, when he comes back as a prisoner, first in 1814 and afterwards in 1815, both times he's treated badly by the Bourbon government. And largely for what we mentioned earlier, sort of alleged war crimes that took place in the revolutionary period, which was quite a while before. It's sort of almost 20 years before, sort of executing émigrés and looting.
Yeah.
But he was forbidden to enter Paris by Louis XVIII. He tries on both occasions, by the way, to ingratiate himself with the king. And he's first exiled to Belgium, but then they say, well, actually, we can't have him in Belgium. He's too dangerous. He's in an area that's potentially a risky area because, of course, the Belgians had fought for Napoleon only the year before 1815. Yeah. And in 1819, like you say, he goes to America. And he contacts other French émigrés over there, including Joseph Bonaparte, who was an old friend who had served under him briefly. Again, Joseph Bonaparte, he got on far well with that Bonaparte brother than Jerome. Mm-hmm. And also, ironically, with Grouchy, who I think he gets on better with in America than he ever did in Belgium. But he lives in the south and he's poor at first, but enters, I think it's the hosiery business. And he does well enough to help other exiles. Returns to Belgium in 1819 and is eventually allowed back into France. But in answer to your question, his future career, I mean, he's never given another command in the French army again. Eventually, he's ultimately given the army pension, and he's acknowledged as someone who's fought well for France. And this is after the Bourbons leave once more and, are supplanted by a more sympathetic regime. But yes, ultimately, he never gets the promotion he wanted.
Yeah. Well, he dies in his native Cassel in 1830. His name is on the Arc de Triomphe, so he must have some favorable legacy. But what do you think his legacy is?
Well, I rather like the title of Gallagher's biography, Napoleon's Enfant Terrible, Terrible Child. And I think that sums him up very succinctly as a formidable soldier who rose during the time of the First French Empire under Napoleon's influence. And I believe he's on a long list of men who fought very valiantly for France and its new form of government, Republican government, but that he had many faults and he paid a heavy price for Napoleon for his loyalty. And I also believe that had the Waterloo campaign gone Napoleon's way, I think he would have got his baton.
Yeah. Yeah, he strikes me as, he's petulant. Yeah, he's hot-headed, but, would you follow this guy into any battle? Probably, because seems pretty fearless, and he worked really hard at being a soldier and being a general.
Well, a quote from the Waterloo film occurs to me here. It's sort of, he was a fine soldier on the battlefield, and this was equally said of one of Wellington's generals right at the start when they've got the famous Waterloo Ball, and one of the ladies comes up to Marshal Wellington, wasn't Marshal Wellington then, General Wellington then, and says to him that General Picton doesn't even know how to walk in a ballroom. And Wellington says, yes, but he dances very well with the French. And I think it's, if you exchange the word French for the British or for the Prussians, he was very good on the battlefield, but he just wasn't a court officer. He wasn't a staff officer. He was too used to speaking his own mind and too blunt.
Yeah, just refused to play that political game where you kept your mouth shut and made smart decisions. But interesting man, this Vandamme. Thank you so much for that, David. Again, David's books, Waterloo, Battlefield Guide, Napoleonic Britain, and Napoleon's Paris, among others, you can find on Amazon, right, David, or anywhere books are sold?
Yes, Amazon is my biggest seller by far, although the Pen and Sword website as well is worth a look.
Also a good option, yes. Well, thank you, David, for this. And thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much.